Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where secrets have been buried for centuries, one conversation would shake the very foundation of the British monarchy. It was a cold February morning when King Charles III made a phone call that would destroy everything he had worked decades to build. The words he spoke weren't meant for the world to hear, but sometimes the truth has a way of finding light in the darkest corners. What started as a private moment of frustration would become the scandal that no royal protocol could contain. For years, the public had watched Charles and Camilla's love story unfold, from forbidden romance to accepted marriage, from controversy to crown. But what they didn't know was that behind closed doors, the fairy tale was crumbling. The recording was only 3 minutes and 47 seconds long, but those precious minutes contained enough explosive revelations to bring down a 1,000-year-old institution. When the world finally heard what King Charles really thought about his wife's future, about her past, and about the choice he was forced to make, everything changed. This isn't just another royal drama. This is the story of how one man's biggest mistake became the monarchy's greatest crisis. This is the story of how love, power, and tradition collided in the most spectacular way possible. And this is the story of how Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who waited decades to become queen consort, discovered that her husband had been planning her downfall all along. The truth was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. And once it was out, there was no going back. The morning of February 15th began like any other at Clarence House. King Charles III sat in his private study, surrounded by towers of official documents and correspondence that required his attention. The weight of the crown, both literally and figuratively, had been pressing down on him for over a year now. Since his mother's passing, every decision felt magnified, every word scrutinized by millions of people around the world. Camilla had left early for a charity engagement in Yorkshire, kissing him goodbye with the same affection she had shown for decades. Their marriage, once the subject of intense public scrutiny and disapproval, had finally found its rhythm in the public eye. The woman who had been branded as the other woman, the homewrecker, the reason for Diana's unhappiness, had slowly but surely won over the British people. Charles watched from his window as her car disappeared down the long driveway, flanked by security vehicles. At 74, he should have felt content. He was finally king, finally married to the woman he had always loved, and finally seeing public acceptance of their union. But contentment was the last thing on his mind that morning. The phone call that would change everything came at exactly 11:37. Charles glanced at the caller ID and saw a name that made his stomach tighten with anxiety. Lord Pemberton, the palace's most trusted advisor on constitutional matters, rarely called unless something serious was brewing. Charles had been expecting this call, dreading it, and hoping it would never come. "Your Majesty," Pemberton's voice was unusually strained. "I'm afraid we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The cabinet has been discussing certain constitutional concerns, and there are questions being raised about the Queen Consort's position." Charles felt his blood pressure rise. He had known this day would come, but knowing and experiencing are two very different things. The conversation that followed would later be described by historians as the moment when personal love collided with institutional survival in the most dramatic way possible. What Charles didn't know was that his private secretary, a man who had served the royal family faithfully for over 2 decades, was in the outer office. The secretary had arrived early to prepare briefing papers for the king's afternoon appointments. The connecting door between the offices was slightly ajar, a detail that would prove catastrophic. The secretary, James Morrison, had always prided himself on his discretion. In 22 years of royal service, he had never once betrayed a confidence or shared private information. But what he was about to overhear would test every principle he had ever held about loyalty and duty. "The problem," Pemberton continued, "is that certain members of Parliament are raising questions about legitimacy. Not yours, of course, Your Majesty, but about the Queen Consort's role in the coronation ceremony. There are constitutional scholars arguing that her participation was irregular, given the circumstances of your previous marriage." Charles gripped the phone tighter. "What circumstances?" "Camilla and I were legally married. The Church of England sanctioned the union. What more do they want? It's not about the legality of your marriage, sir. It's about public perception and constitutional precedent. There are growing calls for a formal review of the Queen Consort's status. Some are even suggesting that for the good of the monarchy, perhaps a different arrangement might be more appropriate." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles stared out at the gardens where he and Camilla had walked just that morning, discussing plans for their upcoming trip to Australia. How could he explain to her that the very institution he had inherited might require him to choose between his crown and his wife? What kind of different arrangement, Charles asked, though he already suspected the answer. There's talk of a separation of duties, Your Majesty. The Queen Consort could maintain her title but perhaps step back from official functions. Some are even suggesting a more formal separation might be necessary to preserve the integrity of the institution. Charles closed his eyes. This was his worst nightmare coming true. After decades of fighting for acceptance, after weathering every storm, after finally reaching the point where the public seemed to embrace Camilla, the very foundation was being pulled out from under them. In the outer office, James Morrison had stopped pretending to work on the briefing papers. Every word of the conversation was burning itself into his memory. He knew he should leave, should close the door, should pretend he had heard nothing. But something kept him frozen in place, listening to the most private fears of a king. "And what if I refuse?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The pause from Pemberton spoke volumes. "Your Majesty, you know as well as I do that the monarchy survives because it adapts. Your mother understood this. She made difficult choices throughout her reign for the good of the institution. Sometimes personal happiness must be sacrificed for the greater good. My mother never had to choose between her husband and her crown."
"No, sir, she didn't."
But circumstances change. The public's tolerance for controversy has limits, and recent polling suggests that support for the Queen Consort remains fragile. One major scandal, one significant misstep, and public opinion could turn decisively against her. Charles felt something snap inside him. The frustration of a lifetime spent waiting, of always having to consider public opinion before personal happiness, of never being allowed to simply be a man in love with his wife came pouring out. "You want to know what I really think?" Charles said, his voice rising with emotion. "I think this is all about control. The cabinet doesn't care about constitutional precedent or public opinion. They care about having a queen consort they can manipulate, someone who will smile and wave and never challenge the status quo. Camilla has opinions. She speaks her mind. She doesn't fit their neat little mold of what a royal wife should be."
Morrison's hands were trembling as he listened.
He had never heard the king speak so openly about the inner workings of the monarchy. "But here's what they don't understand," Charles continued. "Camilla has been preparing for this role her entire adult life. She has earned her place beside me through decades of service, through weathering every storm, through supporting me when I was at my lowest. If they think I'm going to throw her aside now because some politicians are nervous about poll numbers, they're gravely mistaken. Your Majesty, I understand your feelings, but we must consider the practical implications. The monarchy's survival depends on public support. If that support erodes because of controversy surrounding the Queen Consort, it could affect the entire institution." Charles was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was cold, calculated, completely different from the emotional outburst moments before. "What exactly are they proposing? Specifically?" Morrison could hear papers rustling through the phone. "There are several options being discussed. The first would be a gradual withdrawal from public duties. The Queen Consort could cite health concerns, perhaps, and slowly reduce her appearances until she becomes essentially invisible. The second option would be a more formal separation, allowing both of you to maintain your dignity while serving different roles. And the third option? The silence stretched so long that Morrison wondered if the call had been disconnected. "The third option would be more permanent, Your Majesty. A dissolution of the marriage, allowing you to remain king while removing the constitutional complications surrounding the Queen Consort status." The sound that escaped from Charles was something between a laugh and a sob. "You're asking me to divorce the woman I love. Again. After everything we've been through, after all the years we waited, after all the sacrifices we made, you're asking me to throw it all away." "I'm not asking anything, Your Majesty. I'm simply conveying the options that are being discussed at the highest levels of government." Charles stood up and walked to the window again. Camilla's car was returning from her engagement, winding its way up the drive toward the house where she believed she was safe, where she thought her position was secure, where she had no idea that powerful forces were already working to remove her. "How long do I have to decide?" The cabinet would like an answer within the month. They believe that acting quickly will minimize public disruption and allow for a smooth transition to whatever arrangement is chosen. Charles watched as Camilla stepped out of her car, waving to the security team with the same warmth she showed everyone. She looked tired but happy, probably excited to tell him about her day, about the people she had met, and the causes she had supported. How could he tell her that their entire world was about to collapse? "I need time to think, of course, Your Majesty. But please remember, delay could make the situation more complicated. If word of these discussions leaks to the press before a decision is made, it could create a crisis that would be far more damaging than taking proactive action now." After hanging up, Charles sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes. He thought about his mother, about the choices she had made throughout her reign, about the time she had put duty before family. He thought about his first marriage, about the pressure he had felt to choose a wife based on suitability rather than love, about the disaster that followed. He thought about Camilla, about their decades-long journey from forbidden lovers to married couple, about the joy she brought to his life every single day. In the outer office, James Morrison finally moved. He gathered his papers with shaking hands and quietly left the room. He needed air, needed time to process what he had heard, needed to decide what to do with information that could destroy the royal family. But he wouldn't have much time to think. Within hours, events would begin moving with a momentum that no one could control. Charles was still sitting at his desk when Camilla returned. She knocked softly on his study door and entered with a smile that could have lit up the entire palace. "Darling, you won't believe the wonderful woman I met today. She's been running a shelter for abused women for over 20 years, completely on her own, with no government funding. I promised we would visit together next month." "Charles? Charles, what's wrong?" He looked up at her. This woman who had stood by him through scandal and controversy, who had earned her place as his partner through sheer determination and love. How could he tell her that powerful forces were already planning her removal? How could he explain that the very people who were supposed to support them were now working to tear them apart? "Nothing's wrong," he lied, forcing a smile. "Tell me about this remarkable woman." As Camilla settled into the chair across from his desk and began sharing the details of her day, Charles made a decision that would have consequences none of them could imagine. He would not sacrifice his wife to political expediency. He would not repeat the mistakes of his youth. Whatever the cost, whatever the pressure, he would find a way to protect both his crown and his marriage. But what Charles didn't know was that his conversation with Lord Pemberton was already spreading through the palace like wildfire. What he didn't know was that James Morrison, despite his years of loyal service, was struggling with the most difficult decision of his life. What he didn't know was that in trying to protect Camilla, he had already set in motion the very forces that would ultimately destroy everything they had built together. The biggest royal mistake wasn't the decision Charles would make in the coming weeks. It was believing that he could control the consequences of a conversation that was never meant to be overheard. James Morrison had served 3 monarchs during his 22 years at the palace. He had witnessed state visits that changed international relations, private family dramas that never made the headlines, and political negotiations that shaped the future of the Commonwealth. Through it all, he had maintained absolute discretion, understanding that his role required him to be invisible, trustworthy, and completely loyal to the crown. But as he sat in his small flat in Pimlico that evening, staring at his reflection in the darkened window, James felt something he had never experienced before. The weight of knowledge that could destroy everything he had sworn to protect was crushing him from the inside out. The conversation he had overheard between King Charles and Lord Pemberton played on repeat in his mind, each word more damaging than the last. His wife, Margaret, noticed his distraction immediately. After 30 years of marriage, she could read his moods better than he could read them himself. But when she asked what was troubling him, James found himself unable to speak. How could he explain that he had accidentally stumbled upon information that could bring down the monarchy? How could he tell her that he was facing a choice between his loyalty to the crown and his conscience? The next morning brought no relief. James arrived at the palace earlier than usual, hoping that routine might help settle his turbulent thoughts. But as he walked through the corridors where portraits of previous monarchs watched from gilded frames, he felt their judgment weighing upon him. These walls had kept royal secrets for centuries. Who was he to break that tradition now? King Charles arrived at his study at exactly 9 o'clock. As he had every day since becoming monarch. His greeting to James was warm but distracted, and James could see the strain of the previous day's conversation etched in the lines around the king's eyes. Camilla had already left for another engagement, this time visiting a hospice in Sussex. Her schedule had been packed with appearances lately, as if she was trying to prove her worth through sheer volume of public service. As James organized the morning's correspondence, he noticed several letters marked with the distinctive seal of Downing Street. These weren't the usual government communications that crossed the king's desk daily. These carried the weight of urgency, the kind of official gravity that suggested serious political maneuvering was taking place behind the scenes. Charles noticed his secretary's attention to the letters and sighed deeply. "They're from the Prime Minister's office," he said quietly. It seems yesterday's conversation was just the beginning of a much larger campaign. James felt his stomach clench.
Your Majesty, nothing you need to concern yourself with, James.
Just the usual political theater. Sometimes I think they forget that wearing a crown doesn't make one immune to human emotions. But it wasn't just political theater, and both men knew it. Charles opened the first letter and read it with growing dismay. The Prime Minister was requesting a private meeting to discuss matters of constitutional significance. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. The pressure campaign against Camilla was escalating to the highest levels of government. The second letter was from the Archbishop of Canterbury, expressing concerns about recent discussions regarding the royal marriage and requesting guidance on the Church's position should any changes be contemplated. The third letter was perhaps the most ominous of all. It came from the palace's own legal team, outlining various scenarios for managing potential constitutional complications. Charles set the letters aside and looked directly at James. For a moment, the secretary thought the king might have somehow discovered that he had overheard the previous day's conversation. But Charles's expression held only weariness, not suspicion. James, in all your years of service, have you ever faced a situation where your personal beliefs conflicted with your professional duties? The question hit James like a physical blow. Here was his monarch asking the very question that had been tormenting him since yesterday afternoon. How could he answer honestly without revealing what he knew? I believe, Your Majesty, that such conflicts are part of the human condition. The challenge is finding a way to serve both honor and duty without sacrificing one's integrity. Charles studied his secretary's face carefully. And what would you do if you possessed information that could prevent someone from making a terrible mistake, but sharing that information would betray a trust? James felt sweat beginning to form on his brow. Was this a test? Did the king know what he had overheard? Or was Charles simply seeking counsel from someone he trusted, unaware that the person he was confiding in held the key to his dilemma? I suppose, James said carefully, that would depend on whether the greater harm came from keeping the secret or revealing it. Sometimes protecting someone means making choices they might not initially understand or appreciate. Charles nodded slowly, then turned back to the stack of official correspondence. Quite right. Thank you, James. That will be all for now. As James left the study, his hands were trembling. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears. The king was under enormous pressure to make a decision about Camilla, and he had no idea how precarious his position had become. The political forces arrayed against the queen consort were more powerful and organized than even Charles realized. That afternoon, James made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He contacted someone he hadn't spoken to in over 5 years, his former colleague Sarah Chen, who now worked as a senior correspondent for the BBC. Sarah had left palace service to pursue journalism, but she had maintained her connections and her deep understanding of how the royal machinery operated. They met at a small cafe in Bloomsbury, far from the usual haunts of palace staff and royal correspondents. Sarah arrived first, her sharp eyes immediately noting James's nervous demeanor. She had known him during her time at the palace, had respected his professionalism and discretion. Seeing him fidgeting with his coffee cup and constantly checking over his shoulder was completely out of character. "James, you look terrible. What's this about?" He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times during the short journey from the palace, but now that the moment had arrived, the words wouldn't come. How could he betray decades of trust? How could he violate the very principles that had defined his career? "I need to tell you something," he finally managed, "but I need your word that you'll protect the source no matter what happens." Sarah's journalist instincts immediately went on high alert. James Morrison wasn't the type of person to leak information lightly. If he was reaching out to her, something significant was happening at the palace. "You have my word. What's going on?" James took a deep breath and began to speak. He told her about the conversation he had overheard between King Charles and Lord Pemberton. He described the pressure being applied to force the king to choose between his crown and his wife. He explained about the 3 options being presented, including the ultimate demand for another royal divorce. As Sarah listened, her expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something approaching disbelief. If what James was telling her was true, it represented one of the biggest royal stories in decades, but it also represented a complete betrayal of everything the palace claimed to stand for regarding the king and queen consort's marriage. "Are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" she asked. "Every word. I've replayed that conversation in my mind 100 times. Sarah, they're going to destroy her. After everything she's been through, after all the years of building public acceptance, they're planning to throw her away like she never mattered." Sarah pulled out her phone and began taking notes. "This is enormous, James. If this story breaks, it will create a constitutional crisis. Are you prepared for what that means? Are you prepared for the consequences when they trace this back to you?" James had been asking himself the same questions all day. He thought about his pension, about his reputation, about the legal implications of violating his oath of confidentiality. But then he thought about Camilla, blissfully unaware that her own husband was being pressured to abandon her. He thought about the public, who deserved to know that their beloved royal family was nothing more than a carefully constructed facade. She has a right to know what's being planned, he said quietly. And the public has a right to know how their royal family really operates. This isn't about love or duty or service. This is about political calculation and public relations management. Sarah nodded, understanding the magnitude of what James was offering her. I'll need corroboration. I can't run a story this big based solely on one overheard conversation, no matter how reliable the source. I can get you documentation. The letters that arrived this morning, the legal opinions being prepared, the communications with Downing Street, I have access to all of it. James, if you do this, there's no going back. Your career will be over. You could face criminal charges for breach of confidentiality. Your life will never be the same. James looked out the cafe window at the ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that the stability of their constitutional monarchy was hanging by a thread. He thought about his own children, about the kind of world he wanted to leave them, about whether maintaining the facade was worth perpetuating the lies. My life stopped being the same the moment I overheard that conversation, he said. At least this way, someone else gets to make an informed choice about their future. Over the next hour, they worked out the details. Sarah would need time to verify the information and build additional sources. James would carefully document everything he could access without raising suspicion. They would need to move quickly but cautiously. If the palace discovered what was happening before the story broke, both of their lives would be destroyed without accomplishing anything. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Sarah grabbed James's arm. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? Once this story goes public, everything changes. For everyone. James thought about King Charles, sitting in his study surrounded by letters demanding he sacrifice his wife for political convenience. He thought about Camilla, visiting sick children and supporting charitable causes, completely unaware that her own husband was being pressured to divorce her. He thought about the British public, who believed they were supporting a love story when they were actually funding an elaborate lie. I'm certain, he said, someone has to tell the truth. But what James didn't know was that his meeting with Sarah had been noticed. A photographer, working for one of the tabloid newspapers, had captured images of the two former palace employees in deep conversation. The photographer didn't know who James was or why the meeting was significant, but palace staff meeting with BBC correspondents always made for interesting speculation. By the time James returned to work the next morning, a carefully edited version of those photographs was already making its way through the palace grapevine. The images themselves weren't particularly damning. Two people having coffee could mean anything. But in an institution where paranoia and suspicion were survival skills, even innocent meetings were viewed with deep skepticism. Lord Pemberton, reviewing security reports in his office, noticed the photographs in a routine surveillance summary. He recognized James immediately and made a mental note to have the secretary's activities monitored more closely. In his experience, staff members who met with journalists were either selling information or buying it, and neither possibility boded well for palace security. Meanwhile, Charles was preparing for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. Camilla would be returning from her Sussex engagement that evening, and he had decided that he could no longer keep the political pressure secret from her. She deserved to know what they were facing, even if he hadn't yet decided how to respond to the ultimatum. But Camilla's day in Sussex had provided her with information that would complicate Charles's planned conversation in ways he couldn't imagine. During her visit to the hospice, she had been approached by a longtime volunteer who mentioned almost casually that her husband worked in the cabinet office and had been involved in some very unusual meetings recently. Meetings about what? Camilla had asked, her instincts suddenly alert. Oh, I probably shouldn't say, but he mentioned something about constitutional reviews and royal protocols. He's been working very late lately, bringing home stacks of legal documents. I assumed it was just routine government business. Camilla had maintained her composure throughout the rest of the visit, but her mind was racing. Constitutional reviews involving royal protocols could mean only one thing. Someone was questioning her position as queen consort. The conversation had been brief and seemingly innocent, but Camilla hadn't survived decades in the public eye without learning to read between the lines. As she rode back to London, Camilla stared out the car window at the countryside passing by and felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had thought those days were behind her, the days when every phone call could bring news of another scandal, another attack, another attempt to drive her from Charles's side. But perhaps she had been naive to think that becoming queen consort would finally provide security. That evening, both Charles and Camilla would discover that keeping secrets from someone you love is almost impossible when external forces are working to expose the truth. Neither of them knew that James Morrison had already set in motion events that would make their private struggles a matter of public record. Neither of them realized that their marriage was about to become the center of a media storm that would make their previous controversies seem like minor squalls. The biggest royal mistake was still to come, but the foundation for disaster had been laid. In trying to protect each other from painful truths, Charles and Camilla were about to discover that secrets, like lies, have a way of growing until they become too big to contain. The evening of February 18th would later be remembered as the moment when everything began to unravel. Charles had spent the afternoon pacing his study, rehearsing different ways to tell Camilla about the political pressure he was facing. Each potential conversation played out disastrously in his mind. How could he explain that after decades of fighting for their relationship, powerful forces were now demanding he choose between his crown and his marriage? Camilla arrived home from her hospice visit with a brightness that seemed forced, even to Charles's distracted eye. She kissed him with the same warmth as always, but there was something different in her manner, a kind of watchful tension that he couldn't quite identify. Neither of them realized that they were both harboring secrets that would collide with devastating consequences. "How was your day?" Camilla asked, settling into her favorite chair by the fireplace in their private sitting room. "Complicated," Charles replied, pouring himself a whiskey with hands that trembled slightly. "There are some political matters that require discussion." "Political matters involving me, by any chance?" The question caught Charles completely off guard. He turned to face her, and for the first time in their conversation, really looked at her expression. There was no surprise there, no confusion, just the weary resignation of someone who had been expecting bad news.
What makes you ask that?
Camilla smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Charles, I've been navigating royal politics since before we were married. I know when something is brewing. The question is whether you're going to tell me the truth or continue pretending that everything is fine." Charles set down his glass and sat across from her. In that moment, looking at the woman who had stood by him through every storm, who had faced decades of public scrutiny and personal attacks without wavering in her support, he made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "There have been discussions," he began carefully. "Certain members of the government have expressed concerns about the current arrangement." "What kind of concerns?" "Constitutional concerns. They believe that public opinion regarding your role as queen consort remains fragile, and they're worried about potential challenges to the monarchy's stability." Camilla was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was steady but cold. "And what solutions are they proposing to address these constitutional concerns?" Charles hesitated. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when he would have to give voice to the unthinkable options that had been presented to him. "They've suggested several possibilities. A reduction in your public duties, perhaps citing health concerns. A more formal separation of roles where you would maintain the title but step back from official functions. Or a divorce." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Charles hadn't been able to say it, but Camilla had no such difficulty. She had faced this possibility before, had lived with the knowledge that their relationship existed at the pleasure of political and public opinion. That was mentioned as a final option, yes. Camilla stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where they had shared so many private moments over the years. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I needed time to consider the options." She turned back to face him, and Charles was shocked to see not tears, not anger, but something that looked almost like relief in her expression. "At least now we're being honest about what this has always been," she said quietly. "A political arrangement that could be terminated whenever it became inconvenient. That's not fair, and you know it. This marriage has never been a political arrangement. It's the most real thing in my life." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're seriously considering their demands. You're weighing the options, aren't you? Trying to decide whether your wife is worth the political cost." Charles stood up abruptly, stung by the accuracy of her accusation. "What choice do I have? If I refused her demands and public opinion turns decisively against you, it could damage the entire monarchy. Everything my mother built, everything she sacrificed for, could be destroyed. So sacrifice me instead." The brutal simplicity of her statement hit Charles like a physical blow. In trying to explain the impossible position he was in, he had revealed the calculation that lay beneath his anguish. He was weighing her happiness against institutional survival, and they both knew which way the scales were likely to tip. "It's not that simple, isn't it? You made this choice once before, Charles. When you married Diana instead of me, you chose duty over love. You chose what was expected over what you wanted. And now you're being asked to make the same choice again." Charles felt the walls of the room closing in around him. Everything Camilla was saying was true, and the truth was unbearable. This isn't about choosing duty over love. This is about trying to find a way to preserve both. And if that's not possible, If they forced you to choose, the question hung between them unanswered, but the silence was answer enough. Camilla walked over to him and placed a hand on his cheek, a gesture of tenderness that made the moment even more heartbreaking. "I knew this day would come," she said softly. "I've been waiting for it ever since we married. I knew that eventually the institution would demand its pound of flesh, and I would be the logical sacrifice. I won't let that happen. Won't you? Or can't you stop it?" Before Charles could answer, there was a soft knock on the sitting room door. James Morrison entered with obvious reluctance, carrying a folder marked with the distinctive red tape that indicated urgent government correspondence. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Majesty, but Lord Pemberton insisted this be delivered immediately." Charles took the folder with a sinking heart. More demands, more pressure, more impossible choices. As he opened it, Camilla watched his face carefully, noting the way his expression shifted from apprehension to shock to something approaching panic. "What is it?" Charles looked up at her, then at James, who was still standing by the door with an expression of barely concealed distress. For a moment, Charles wondered if his private secretary somehow knew about the conversation they had been having, but he dismissed the thought as paranoia. "There's been a development," Charles said carefully. "It seems someone has been asking questions about our private affairs. There are rumors circulating that could complicate matters significantly." What Charles didn't know was that James Morrison was fighting an internal battle that was tearing him apart. Standing in that room, watching the king and queen consort grapple with forces beyond their control, James knew that his conversation with Sarah Chen had set in motion events that would soon explode into public view. The story was already being researched, sources were being contacted, and within days the entire world would know about the pressure being applied to force Charles to abandon his wife. But James also knew something else, something that made his betrayal feel even more complex and morally ambiguous. Earlier that day, he had received additional information that cast the government's demands in an even more sinister light. The pressure on Charles wasn't just about public opinion or constitutional concerns. It was part of a larger political strategy to reshape the monarchy itself, to create a more malleable institution that would be easier to control. The government officials pushing for Camilla's removal weren't concerned about protecting the monarchy from controversy. They were concerned about protecting themselves from a queen consort who had proven herself to be independent-minded and politically astute. Camilla's years of experience navigating royal politics had made her a formidable presence, someone who couldn't be easily managed or manipulated. "Your Majesty," James said quietly, "if I may suggest, it might be wise to consider how this information became public. Someone with access to very private discussions has been sharing details with outside parties."
Charles looked at his secretary sharply.
"Are you suggesting there's been a breach of security?" "I'm suggesting that in situations like this, it's often the case that information flows in directions that weren't intended. Sometimes people believe they're acting in your best interests when they're actually making the situation more complicated." Camilla studied James's face carefully. There was something in his expression, a kind of guilty knowledge, that made her instincts prickle with awareness. She had spent decades reading people, learning to detect the subtle signs that indicated when someone was hiding something important. "James," she said quietly, "is there something specific you think we should know?" The moment stretched endlessly. James looked at the two people he had served faithfully for years, two people who were about to face the greatest crisis of their lives, two people who had no idea that their private struggles were about to become front-page news around the world. He could tell them what was coming, could give them a chance to prepare, could help them control the narrative before it spiraled completely out of their hands. But he could also stay silent, could maintain the fiction of ignorance, could pretend that he hadn't been the one to light the fuse that would soon explode their world into fragments. "I think," he said finally, "that you should be prepared for the possibility that private matters may become public knowledge sooner than you might expect." Charles set down the government folder without reading the rest of its contents. "How much sooner?" "Perhaps within days, Your Majesty." The implications of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. If their private crisis became public knowledge while Charles was still considering his options, it would eliminate any possibility of managing the situation quietly. The government's demands, the pressure on their marriage, the constitutional questions surrounding Camilla's role, all of it would become fodder for tabloid headlines and political commentary. "Then we need to make some decisions quickly," Charles said. Camilla walked back to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. When she spoke, her voice was calm but final. "No, Charles, you need to make some decisions quickly. I've already made mine." Both men turned to look at her, but she continued staring out into the darkness. "I won't be the reason the monarchy faces another crisis. I won't be the cause of another constitutional emergency. And I won't put you in the position of choosing between me and your duty again." "Camilla, what are you saying?" She turned to face him, and Charles was struck by the composure in her expression. This wasn't the reaction of someone who had been blindsided by devastating news. This was the response of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. I'm saying that I release you from any obligation to defend me. If the government wants me gone, if the public can't accept me, if the institution requires my sacrifice, then so be it. I've had a good run, Charles. Better than I ever expected when this all began. I won't accept that. You don't have a choice. None of us do. The monarchy is bigger than our personal happiness, and we both know it. Your mother understood that. Diana learned it the hard way. Now it's my turn to accept reality. Charles felt something break inside him. After decades of fighting for their love, after weathering every storm, after finally reaching the point where they could be together publicly and officially, it was all being taken away by political calculation and institutional cowardice. There has to be another way. There isn't, and we both know it. The only question now is whether we control the narrative or let others control it for us. James Morrison stood in the corner of the room, watching the destruction of a relationship that had survived everything the world had thrown at it, and felt the full weight of what he had set in motion. In trying to give them a chance to fight back, he had actually accelerated their destruction. The story that would break in the coming days would make it impossible for Charles and Camilla to find any middle ground, any compromise that might have saved their marriage while preserving the monarchy. The biggest royal mistake wasn't the government's pressure campaign, wasn't Charles's hesitation, wasn't even Camilla's resignation to her fate. The biggest mistake was believing that the truth, once revealed, would somehow make everything better. But truth, James was learning, was often the most destructive force of all. As the three of them stood in that room, none of them knew that within 72 hours, the most intimate details of their crisis would be splashed across newspaper headlines around the world. None of them knew that the conversation they were having would soon be dissected by political commentators and royal experts on every television network. None of them knew that the careful balance they had all worked so hard to maintain was about to be shattered forever. The explosion was coming, and there was no way to stop it. The morning of February 21st dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself was reflecting the mood inside the palace walls. Sarah Chen sat in her office at BBC headquarters, staring at her computer screen with a mixture of excitement and dread. The story she had been working on for 3 days was finally ready, and she knew it would change everything. James Morrison's information had proven to be just the beginning. Through careful investigation and multiple sources, Sarah had uncovered a web of political maneuvering that went far deeper than even James had realized. The pressure on King Charles to remove Camilla wasn't just about public opinion or constitutional concerns. It was part of a coordinated effort by certain government officials to reshape the monarchy into a more politically compliant institution. Her phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. The caller ID showed a number she recognized. It was her editor, David Walsh, calling from his car on the way to an emergency editorial meeting.
Sarah, I've just been briefed on your royal story.
Please tell me you're absolutely certain about every detail. Because if we run this and get it wrong, it won't just end your career. It could bring down the entire news organization. I've triple-checked everything, David. I have documentation, multiple sources, and corroboration from inside the government. This story is solid. And you're certain about the timeline? The government really gave the king a 1-month ultimatum to choose between his wife and his crown? Sarah looked at the stack of documents spread across her desk. Phone records, meeting schedules, leaked memos, and carefully worded official communications that, when read together, painted a picture of institutional betrayal that was breathtaking in its scope. The ultimatum was delivered on February 15th. We're now 6 days into that month. Based on my sources, the king hasn't given them an answer yet, but the pressure is intensifying daily. What kind of pressure? Legal opinions questioning the validity of the coronation ceremony. Polling data suggesting that public support for the queen consort could collapse with the right kind of media campaign. Threats to withdraw government support for key royal initiatives. They're not just asking him to divorce his wife, David. They're making it clear that refusing could destabilize the entire constitutional framework. David was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could hear the sound of London traffic through his phone. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with tension. Have you attempted to get comment from the palace? I've submitted formal requests for comment through the press office. No response yet, but I wouldn't expect one until they've had time to assess the damage. And your source inside the palace? Are you confident they won't be identified? Sarah thought about James Morrison, who had risked everything to expose the truth. She had done everything possible to protect his identity, but in a story this explosive, there were no guarantees. Someone at the palace would eventually figure out who had access to the information that formed the backbone of her reporting. I've taken every precaution, but this story involves information from multiple sources at multiple levels. It's going to be difficult to trace back to any one person. All right, we're going live with this at 6 tonight on the evening news. I want you in the studio ready to answer questions, because once this breaks, every news organization in the world is going to be scrambling to catch up. After hanging up, Sarah stared out her office window at the gray London sky and wondered if she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career. The story was true. She was certain of that. But truth and wisdom weren't always the same thing. By exposing the government's pressure campaign against Camilla, she might be saving the royal marriage, or she might be destroying it completely. Meanwhile, at the palace, James Morrison was experiencing his own crisis of conscience. He had arrived at work that morning to find a note on his desk requesting his immediate presence in Lord Pemberton's office. The summons wasn't unusual in itself, but something about the timing made his stomach clench with anxiety. Lord Pemberton's office was located in the oldest part of the palace, surrounded by portraits of long-dead courtiers who had served previous monarchs with the kind of absolute loyalty that was now being questioned. Pemberton himself sat behind a desk that had been used by palace officials for over 200 years, a physical reminder of the traditions that James was about to betray. "James, thank you for coming. Please, sit down." The older man's tone was cordial, but James could detect an underlying tension that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine administrative meeting. "I've been reviewing some security reports from the past few days," Pemberton continued, "and your name has appeared in several contexts that concern me." James felt his palms beginning to sweat. "I'm not sure I understand, Lord Pemberton. You were seen meeting with Sarah Chen, formerly of our press office, now with the BBC. You've been accessing files related to constitutional matters that aren't strictly within your purview, and there have been some unusual patterns in your computer usage that suggest you've been copying documents." The accusations hung in the air like physical objects. James knew that denial would be pointless. Palace security was too thorough, too professional to make mistakes about basic facts. But he also knew that admitting guilt would mean the end of everything he had worked for over the past 2 decades. "I can explain all of those things," he said carefully. "I'm sure you can. But before you do, let me share something with you that might influence your explanation. We've received information that suggests a major story about the royal family is about to break in the media. A story that could only have come from someone with access to the most private communications between His Majesty and his advisors." James felt the walls of the office closing in around him. There was no escape now, no way to maintain the fiction of innocence. Pemberton knew exactly what he had done, and the only question remaining was what consequences he would face. "The question," Pemberton continued, "is whether this leak represents a momentary lapse in judgment or something more systematic. Whether you've been sharing information with journalists as part of some misguided attempt to help their majesties, or whether you've been systematically betraying your oath for personal gain." James looked at the older man across the desk and made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of denying everything or trying to minimize his actions, he chose to tell the complete truth. "I overheard the conversation between His Majesty and yourself on February 15th. I heard about the government's demands, about the ultimatum, about the pressure being applied to force the king to choose between his wife and his crown. I contacted Sarah Chen because I believed the queen consort had a right to know what was being planned, and the public had a right to understand what was really happening behind the palace walls." Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And it never occurred to you that by making this information public, you might be making the situation worse rather than better?"
How could it be worse? You're asking the king to divorce the woman he loves for political convenience.
"You're treating their marriage like a business arrangement that can be terminated whenever it becomes inconvenient. How is that serving the monarchy or the people?" "You naive fool," Pemberton said, his composure finally cracking. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't about politics or convenience. This is about survival. The monarchy exists because the public allows it to exist. If public opinion turns decisively against the institution, everything collapses. Everything." James stood up, his own anger finally matching Pemberton's. "And what about justice? What about loyalty? What about the fact that you're asking a man to destroy his own happiness to preserve an institution that apparently has no real principles? Principles are luxuries that institutions can't afford. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years because it has learned to adapt, to sacrifice individual desires for collective stability. Your little act of conscience may have just undermined centuries of careful balance. Maybe it's time for that balance to be undermined." The words hung between them like a challenge. James had crossed a line from which there was no return, had declared himself an enemy of the very institution he had served faithfully for over 2 decades. But for the first time since overhearing that fateful conversation, he felt a sense of peace. Pemberton stood up slowly, his face flushed with anger. "You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you are never to set foot on palace property again. Consider yourself fortunate that we're not pursuing criminal charges for breach of confidentiality." James nodded calmly. He had expected this outcome, had prepared for it. What he hadn't expected was how liberating it would feel to finally stop carrying the weight of institutional secrets. As he was escorted from the palace by security officers, James caught a glimpse of King Charles walking through one of the corridors with a group of advisors. The king looked older than he had just days ago, worn down by the pressure of impossible choices. James wondered if the story that would break in a few hours would make Charles's situation better or worse, but he no longer had any control over the outcome. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, word had begun to spread through the palace that a major media story was imminent. The press office was flooded with calls from journalists seeking comment on rumors about the royal marriage. Palace staff members who normally handled such inquiries with practiced calm were clearly rattled by the volume and specificity of the questions being asked. Charles was in a meeting with constitutional lawyers when his private secretary's replacement brought him the news. The new secretary, a nervous young man named Timothy, knocked on the door with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty, I apologize for the interruption, but the press office has requested an urgent consultation. They're receiving inquiries about very specific matters that they feel require your direct input." Charles excused himself from the legal meeting and followed Timothy to the press office, where he found a scene of barely controlled chaos. Phones were ringing constantly. Staff members were huddled around computers reading what appeared to be advanced copies of news reports, and the normally unflappable press secretary looked like she was on the verge of a breakdown.
Your Majesty, we have a serious problem, she said without preamble.
The BBC is planning to run a story tonight that contains detailed information about private conversations and government pressure regarding the Queen Consort's position. The information is accurate enough that it had to come from someone with direct access to your private communications. Charles felt his blood run cold. How detailed? They know about Lord Pemberton's call, about the 3 options that were presented, about the 1-month timeline. They know about the legal opinions and the communications with Downing Street. They know everything, Your Majesty. What do they want from us? Comment. They've submitted a list of questions that basically asks you to confirm or deny the accuracy of their reporting. But the questions themselves reveal the scope of what they know. Even if you refuse to comment, the story makes it clear that you're facing pressure to make a choice about your marriage. Charles sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications. The careful balance he had been trying to maintain, the private negotiations he had been conducting to find a middle ground, the time he had been hoping to buy to find an alternative solution, all of it was about to be swept away by a media firestorm.
Where is the Queen Consort?
At home, Your Majesty. She's not scheduled for any public appearances today. Get her on the phone. She needs to know what's coming before she hears it from someone else. As the press secretary made the call, Charles thought about the conversation he and Camilla had shared 3 nights earlier. She had been prepared for this crisis, had almost seemed to be expecting it. Now he understood why. Somehow, some way, she had sensed that their private struggles wouldn't remain private for long. The phone call was brief and devastating. Camilla listened to the summary of the impending media storm with the same calm acceptance she had shown when discussing the government's demands. When Charles finished explaining the situation, there was a long pause before she spoke. "So it's over then?" "Not necessarily. We can fight this. We can challenge the accuracy of the reporting, question the sources, demand retractions. Charles, we both know that won't work. The information is too accurate, too detailed. Someone inside our inner circle has decided that the truth needs to come out. And now it's going to come out whether we want it to or not. What do you want to do?" Another long pause. "I want to have dinner with my husband one last time before everything changes forever." That evening, as Sarah Chen prepared to go on air with a story that would dominate headlines around the world, Charles and Camilla sat in their private dining room sharing what they both knew might be their final meal together as a married couple. The television was on in the background, volume turned low, waiting for the 6 o'clock news that would transform their private crisis into public spectacle. At exactly 6 o'clock, Sarah Chen looked directly into the camera and began to speak. "Good evening. Tonight, the BBC has learned of extraordinary pressure being applied to King Charles III by government officials demanding that he choose between his marriage and his crown." As the story unfolded on television screens across Britain and around the world, Charles reached across the table and took Camilla's hand. Whatever came next, whatever decisions they were forced to make, whatever consequences they would face them together. But even as they sat holding hands in the candlelight, Both of them knew that the biggest royal mistake had already been made. The truth was out, and there was no way to put it back. The explosion was immediate and devastating. Within minutes of Sarah Chen's broadcast ending, every major news organization in the world was scrambling to match the BBC's reporting. Social media erupted with hashtags supporting both the king and queen consort, while political commentators began analyzing the constitutional implications of what would quickly be dubbed the royal ultimatum crisis. Charles and Camilla sat in their private sitting room watching the coverage unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. The intimate details of their marriage, the pressure they had been facing, the impossible choices that had been thrust upon them, all of it was now public knowledge, dissected and analyzed by strangers who claimed to understand the complexities of their situation. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed within the first hour. Calls poured in from journalists, from members of parliament, from Commonwealth leaders, from ordinary citizens who felt compelled to express their support or outrage. The press office, already struggling to manage the crisis, found itself completely unable to keep up with the volume of inquiries, but the most significant response came from an unexpected source. At 7:37 that evening, Charles received a phone call that would change everything. The caller ID showed a number he recognized but hadn't expected to see. It was his son, William, calling from his own residence where he had been watching the news coverage with growing alarm. "Father, we need to talk, now." The urgency in William's voice was unmistakable. Charles had been dreading this conversation, knowing that his son would have strong opinions about the crisis that was now engulfing the family. "William, I know this is difficult to understand, but the situation is more complicated than the media reports suggest." "Is it? Because from what I'm seeing, the government gave you an ultimatum to choose between your wife and your crown, and you've been considering it for nearly a week without telling anyone in the family." "That doesn't seem complicated, Father. That seems like betrayal." Charles felt the words like physical blows. He had been so focused on protecting Camilla from the political pressure that he hadn't considered how his own family would react to learning about the crisis through media reports. "I was trying to find a solution that would protect everyone. By keeping us in the dark? By letting us find out along with the rest of the world that our family is under attack? Father, do you have any idea what this means for the monarchy, for all of us?" Charles looked across the room at Camilla, who was listening to the conversation with an expression of growing sadness. She had always worried that their relationship would ultimately damage Charles's family, would create divisions that could never be healed. "What do you want me to say, William?" "I want you to say that you're going to fight. I want you to say that you're not going to let a group of politicians destroy your marriage for their own political convenience. I want you to say that you remember what it means to be a member of this family." The words hung in the air between them, carrying decades of complicated family history. William's parents' marriage had been destroyed by political pressure and public scrutiny. His mother had died as a direct result of the toxic relationship between the royal family and the media. Now history seemed to be repeating itself, with different players but the same devastating consequences. "It's not that simple, William. There are constitutional implications that go beyond personal feelings." "Then change the Constitution, modernize the monarchy. Show the world that we're not just puppets dancing to whatever tune the government plays." Charles was quiet for a long moment, struck by the passion in his son's voice. William had grown up understanding the burdens of royal life, but he had also inherited a modern sensibility that sometimes clashed with traditional expectations. "And if that destroys public support for the monarchy? If it creates a constitutional crisis that undermines everything we represent? Then we face that crisis honestly, as a family, instead of letting politicians manipulate us from behind the scenes." "Father, the monarchy's greatest strength has always been its ability to evolve. But you can't evolve if you're too scared to take a stand." After the call ended, Charles found himself staring out the window at the crowds that had gathered outside the palace gates. Even in the darkness, he could see the signs and banners that supporters had brought, messages of support for both him and Camilla. The public response to the crisis wasn't the universal condemnation that the government had predicted. Instead, it was complex, nuanced, and largely sympathetic to the impossible position the royal couple found themselves in. Camilla joined him at the window, slipping her arm through his as they watched the crowd together. "William is right, you know," she said quietly. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about what kind of monarchy Britain wants to have in the 21st century. Are you willing to fight for that?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the faces in the crowd below. "I'm willing to fight for you. I'm willing to fight for our marriage. But most importantly, I'm willing to fight for the principle that love should matter more than political calculation." The next morning brought news that would completely transform the crisis. Charles woke to find Timothy, his new private secretary, standing by his bed with an expression of barely contained excitement. Your Majesty, I apologize for waking you, but there have been some extraordinary developments overnight that you need to know about immediately. Charles sat up, instantly alert. What kind of developments? The Prime Minister has called an emergency cabinet meeting for this afternoon. Several ministers who are part of the group pressuring you to divorce the Queen Consort have been forced to resign due to public backlash. And perhaps most significantly, there's been a massive shift in public opinion overnight. Timothy handed him a tablet displaying the latest polling data. The numbers were stunning. Support for King Charles had increased by 15 percentage points since the BBC story broke. Support for Camilla had increased by even more. Most remarkably, support for the monarchy as an institution had reached its highest level in over a decade. How is this possible? It appears that the public interpreted the government's pressure campaign as an attack on the monarchy itself rather than an attempt to protect it. People are rallying to defend your right to choose your own wife, and they're viewing the political interference as fundamentally undemocratic. Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The crisis that was supposed to destroy his marriage had instead revealed the strength of public support for the principle that even kings should be allowed to marry for love. The phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock. This time it was Lord Pemberton, calling with a tone very different from their previous conversations. Your Majesty, I hope you've seen the polling data from overnight.
I'll have.
The political landscape has shifted dramatically. The ministers who were driving the pressure campaign have been forced to step back, and the Prime Minister is now looking for a way to resolve this crisis without further damage to the government's relationship with the Crown. Charles felt a surge of satisfaction. And what resolution are they proposing? Complete withdrawal of all demands regarding the Queen Consort's position, an official statement supporting your marriage and expressing regret for any constitutional confusion, and a commitment to work with you on modernizing royal protocols to prevent similar situations in the future. It was total capitulation, a complete reversal of everything the government had been demanding just days earlier. The political calculation had backfired spectacularly, and now the same officials who had been pressuring Charles to divorce his wife were scrambling to distance themselves from the crisis. What changed their minds? Public opinion, Your Majesty. The voters made it clear that they view attacks on your marriage as attacks on the monarchy itself. The government cannot afford to be seen as undermining an institution that has suddenly become more popular than any political party. Charles looked across the room at Camilla, who was reading the morning newspapers with an expression of amazement. The headlines that should have destroyed them were instead declaring their victory over political interference. There is one more thing, Your Majesty. We've identified the source of the leak that led to the BBC story. Charles felt his stomach tighten. James Morrison, yes. How did you know? I suspected. He was acting strangely in the days before the story broke, asking unusual questions, making comments that seemed designed to warn us about what was coming. He's been terminated, of course, and we're considering whether to pursue criminal charges for breach of confidentiality. Charles was quiet for a moment, thinking about the man who had risked everything to expose the truth about the pressure campaign. James Morrison's betrayal had nearly destroyed them, but it had also ultimately saved them. No charges, Charles said finally. Your Majesty, I said no charges. James Morrison may have violated his oath, but he also revealed a conspiracy against the Crown that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the end, his actions served the monarchy better than those who were trying to manipulate it from within. After hanging up, Charles walked over to where Camilla was sitting with the newspapers spread around her like fallen leaves. The headlines told a story of triumph over adversity, of love conquering political calculation, of a modern monarchy that was finally learning to stand up for itself. So we won? She asked, looking up at him with a smile that was both relieved and slightly disbelieving. It appears we did. The question now is what we do with this victory. We use it to build something better. We use it to prove that the monarchy can be both traditional and progressive, both respectful of the past and relevant to the future. We use it to show that love and duty don't have to be mutually exclusive. Charles sat down beside her and picked up one of the newspapers. The editorial, written by a constitutional scholar, argued that the royal couple's handling of the crisis had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership Britain needed in the modern era: principled, authentic, and unafraid to challenge outdated assumptions. Do you think James Morrison knew this would happen when he leaked the story? Camilla considered the question carefully. I think he knew that keeping the truth secret was wrong, and he was willing to accept the consequences of revealing it. Whether he could have predicted that it would turn out well for us is another matter entirely. Should I try to reach out to him? Express some kind of gratitude for what he did? No. He made his choice, and we made ours. The fact that everything worked out doesn't change the fact that he betrayed his oath. But it also doesn't change the fact that sometimes betrayal serves a higher purpose. 3 weeks later, Charles and Camilla made their first joint public appearance since the crisis began. They visited the hospice in Sussex, where Camilla had been on the day the political pressure reached its peak, the same hospice where she had first heard hints about the government meetings that were threatening their marriage. The reception was extraordinary. Crowds lined the streets holding signs that read, "Love wins and our king and queen." The woman who had once been reviled as the other woman was now being celebrated as a symbol of enduring love and modern marriage. During the visit, Camilla pulled aside the volunteer who had mentioned her husband's late-night work on constitutional matters. The woman looked embarrassed, clearly aware that her casual comment had played a role in exposing the crisis. "I hope I didn't cause any trouble with my chattering," the woman said. "On the contrary," Camilla replied with a smile. "You may have saved my marriage." That evening, as they returned to their private residence, Charles and Camilla reflected on the extraordinary month they had survived. The crisis that was supposed to destroy them had instead made them stronger. The political pressure that was meant to drive them apart had ultimately brought them closer together. The biggest royal mistake, trusting that powerful people would act honorably behind closed doors, had been transformed into the greatest royal victory in decades. "Do you think this changes everything?" Camilla asked as they sat together in the same sitting room where they had faced their darkest moment. "I think it changes the most important thing," Charles replied. "It proves that the monarchy belongs to the people, not to the politicians. And the people have made it clear that they believe in love, in authenticity, in the right of even kings and queens to choose their own happiness." The recording device that had captured their most private conversations was never found. James Morrison, living quietly in retirement, never revealed whether he had made additional recordings or whether the government's pressure campaign had been even more extensive than publicly reported. Some secrets he had learned were worth keeping, but the secret that mattered most, the depth of love between a king and his queen, and the power of that love to transform an ancient institution, was no longer secret at all. It had become the foundation of a modern monarchy that was finally learning to trust its people with the truth.